Welcome back to the Wisdom of Trauma series. My name is Maurizio Benazzo.
My name is Aya Benazzo, and we are the founders of Science and Non-Duality and the film directors.
Today's guest in conversation with Gabor Maté is Diane Poole Heller.
Diane is an established expert in the field of child and adult attachment theory, trauma resolution, and integrative healing techniques. She's a trainer, presenter, speaker, offering workshops and educational material on trauma and attachment models. Diane developed her signature series on adult attachment called Dynamic Attachment Repatterning Experiencing there. And she has also taught for over 25 years with Dr. Peter Levine, Somatic Experiencing. Diane's latest book is The Power of Attachment, How to Create Deep and Lasting Intimate Relationships.
Yeah, I want to also add a personal note because Diane was with us at 1440 a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, and it was such a joy and a pleasure to have you around, Diane. It was you're such a brilliant and pleasurable person to spend time with. It's a joy to have you back.
Thank you for being here today. Welcome, Gabor. Welcome, Diane.
I'm so happy to be here, and it was a delight to be with you as it is today.
Thank you, Diane. It's nice to meet you as well. If you don't mind, I'll start with a couple of questions, if that's okay.
I would love that. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is when we talk about trauma, it's necessarily has a negative and painful connotation, but you really insist that traumatized people should not be looked at as damaged goods and as sort of hopelessly stuck individuals. Can you just talk about that side of looking at trauma?
I feel we have this inherent capacity to heal, and trauma can be an incredible catalyst for us to actually grow and mature if we have the right help in moving through it. I think unresolved trauma can take us to the darkest places humans can go, but it also fuels a lot of energy. I think it was Gurdjieff that said the best time to do spiritual work is when the planet is in great turmoil, and he did most of his work during World War II. But if you think about the energy that trauma creates, and if we can align with the suffering in a way to tap that energy but move it as a person's ready and able to integrate it towards transformation, it can actually take us to post-traumatic growth, you might say, or just this incredible maturity and actually an ability to experience spiritual states that we wouldn't have been able to experience otherwise.
You know, I always think of the two sides of trauma by three characters come to mind. One is Buddha, the other is Hitler, or Stalin for that matter. And Hitler and Stalin were horribly traumatized children who never worked out their trauma and ended up inflicting on our entire societies. Buddha was a traumatized child. His mother died when he was a week old. And he worked it through and became this avatar of compassion. And all of those people were fueled by the energy of trauma. I think that's what you're referring to.
Yes, it's incredibly powerful. And I think the most challenging and also important task is how do we align with that degree of suffering in a way that can hopefully fuel us towards integration and maturity and growth and expansion and regained vitality. But I'm not trying to say this is an easy process. Can be just even learning to meet people in really dark places and letting them be where they are and then helping them where the window is open to start to move towards something that's a bit more in the healing direction, I think is the really art and skill of anyone that's trying to support someone that's had a lot of trauma. I've had a lot of trauma in my own history, so I'm not speaking, from an idea. I'm speaking from a lived experience as well.
You know, I think there are two kinds of people in the world: those that know they were traumatized, that don't, and those that were traumatized but they don't know it. And
I have that idea too.
I'm interested in particularly your work on attachment, because usually when we talk about trauma, we think of the terrible things that happen to people, especially early in life: the sexual, the physical, emotional abuse, the violence in the family, the addiction in the family, the parents' mental illness, the stress that happens, the rancors, divorce, the poverty, the racism that is inflicted on young children. And those are traumatic. But in my sense of it is that it's, if you understand trauma as the wound that it is, it's possible for people to be hurt not because these terrible things happened, but because their needs weren't met, their attachment needs weren't met. And so that people can be hurt and wounded in that way as well. And I believe that's where your work is just so important. Can you talk about, if you agree with that perspective, and maybe you don't, but if you do, what
I
is
have
your take?
somewhat
What is your take on that perspective? Is what I'm saying.
I have somewhat of a maniacal focus on attachment because I taught trauma at all the different categories of medical trauma or war trauma or whatever. I mean, all the different myriads of ways suffering can happen. And what I started to really realize, what was a key part of it, was a broken connection. That one of the outcomes of having something so stressful, regardless of the initiating event, which sometimes contextually is important, of course, uh, it takes us to a deep place of losing contact with ourselves, losing contact with our bodies, losing contact with the ground, losing contact with our spiritual awareness, losing contact with other people in particular. We lose the sense of there's any kind of empathetic other or any person that we can trust. And it's a devastation gift that keeps on giving, of just the losses of being able to be present in your life. And if you just look at it, our returning to our own selves and our own ability to be present and show up, that I think is the challenge of regardless of which traumatic event took you to the disconnection. So when I sort of deeply felt that underlying difficulty, I decided I needed to study attachment from the very beginning of where connection can even happen, from in utero and all the way afterwards. And how do we heal this capacity to connect? Because connecting to ourselves and certainly connecting to other people, I think, is one of the most healing agents for us to come back into our true vitality, our true purpose, our true ability to contribute whatever it is we have to contribute. But trauma is a big teacher. Trauma gives us a lot of lessons along the way, as painful as it is.
So what I'd like to, if that works for you, look at this in the conversation is just what happens in attachment relationships that aren't overtly terrible, but which nevertheless can be wounding. And I think that conversation needs to begin by understanding what the needs of a human beings are. And there are certain irreducible needs that children have that if those needs are not met in the attachment relationship, those children are hurt, even though nobody did anything terrible to them. So that's the difficult concept for a lot of people to get, because they think of trauma as only these dire events, which is legitimate, but I think it leaves out that whole area of being wounded when an attachment needs are not being met. Now, what would you say those basic needs are that children have, especially needs that in this society are so often frustrated?
Well, let's take a look at it through the lens of secure attachment, because the secure attachment is sort of the ideal scenario. And that would be where parents are naturally present, they're attuned to the child, they can align with the child's inner state, they know to have skin to skin contact right when the baby's born and all the way as much as they can thereafter in a safe way. They know naturally to be protective, they know naturally to respond to needs that are possible, and they know how to support autonomy and age developmental appropriateness. They don't take over when the child can do something for themselves. They support that autonomy, and they just have this ability when, of course, there's going to be misattunements. I mean, no parent listening should think they have to be perfect all the time. It's not going to happen. But just that when there is a misattunement, they're aware enough to go, okay, I was kind of abrupt this morning when I was shooing the kids off to school, or I didn't answer them on something, or I didn't do the best I could. They know to come back in and repair. Repair is one of the most important things to develop relational resiliency, is just acknowledging, okay, I screwed up. I'd like to do this differently, or I'd like to acknowledge that I hurt you, or just having a way to repair something that went off, and modeling that for kids. When I do my workshops, I always ask the audience how many people had good repair messages when they were a kid. And these are therapists usually, so it's a whole professional audience, and it's usually 5% of that had repair modeled in their household. So even just that is a huge thing to learn that can take us more towards secure attachment. But a lot of things can go off, so we can certainly talk about what can go off.
So first of all, in this culture, there's so much working against parents' capacity to be that attuned presence that you talk about. You know that something like 25% of American women have to go back to work within 2 months of giving birth. That's unbelievable. When you look at the actual studies of what children need, they need to be with their parents for years, not for weeks, not for months, but for years in the early years. So that we're not blaming individual parents here. What we're looking at here is the traumatic impact of a culture that doesn't support parenting. Now, what you say about the repair experience, I'm going to ask you to talk more about that because you know what? Now that you mention it, there's not a single instance that I can recall of my parents ever coming to do any repair. The repair had to always be initiated by myself, you know, and I'm not blaming my parents. You know, they loved me, they did their best, um, but repair, wow! If I put that into the mix, it just wasn't there.
That's sadly the most common experience when I talk to people about it. And it is a skill to learn. I think it's one of the most important things to learn. Actually, John Gottman, who does all the research on successful, adult relationships, he said that you can increase the well-being in your adult relationship by 85% in a consistent, sustainable way if you learn how to initiate and receive repair. So, I mean, that's a great rate of return on benefit from learning this one skill.
So, what would that look like in the context of a 2-year-old, a child with a family with a 2-year-old child, and say I, as the father, yelled at that kid, which, by the way, I did when my kids were small. What would repair look like in that context?
It could possibly look like, just as an example, bringing the little guy on your lap and just saying, honey, I know I probably scared you when I yelled at you, and I know you dropped the milk or whatever, and we cleaned it up and it's all fine. And I just want to hold you and sort of help the child soothe and come back into that bond, come back into that contact and say, of course you're going to make mistakes sometimes, and I'm sorry I got so upset.
So,
How are you doing? Yeah.
what an example, because a lot of parents are taught when when the child does something they disapprove of to actually withdraw from the relationship and do this timeout business and let the kid come back into the relationship once they've learned how to behave. So there's a very famous Canadian psychologist who sold mega millions of books. I won't mention his name, but he actually talks about how an angry child should be made to sit by themselves
I
until they
totally
become.
disagree.
Well, disagree. I think it's toxic, but I'm talking about
Hmm.
that toxic advice is given to a lot of parents that you actually make the child do the repair for having a normal emotional reaction.
Yes, and what people don't understand is connection is what regulates us. We have a pro-social brain. Our nervous systems are primed for connection, and if we can help connection be healthy connection, it solves so many other problems. And so I agree with you that timeouts. I don't even agree with timeouts. There's studies on if you have a dog and the dog gets in the trash or something, and you throw them out in the backyard, whatever. If you leave them out in the backyard for more 20 minutes, it starts to wreck the relationship you have with the dog. I mean, think about how much more sensitive a child is. You don't banish them. You keep them connected and try to talk to them about what could work better in the future, what new behavior might be more useful for you if
Well,
it's your fault, or for them if they're acting out in some way. It's difficult.
there's a psychiatrist, a Buddhist psychiatrist, Mark Epstein, who wrote a book called The Trauma of Everyday Life. And this kind of stuff that we do to kids all the time, I think is part of the trauma of everyday life. Like, we're traumatizing our kids, we're wounding them without doing anything quote unquote terrible, just because we don't understand the the attachment needs of the child.
Well, it's just like when I was growing up, it was popular to have this idea that you let kids cry till they stop
Yeah,
crying, right? And I
yeah.
think that's caused a lot of problems throughout the culture. It may still be causing problems. It's just
Yeah.
not really understanding how to meet and keep connection going in a healthy way.
Now, if you study hunter-gatherer groups, by the way, which has been done, they never let their kids cry. It's not that they forbid them to cry; they pick them up right away.
Hmm. Well,
When
they had
kids are,
those like little containers that they had right against their body while they were out in the farm, farming or doing whatever. They kept the
absolutely,
connection going. The indigenous tribes seem to have it down better than our more quote Western civilized, whatever we call ourselves, seem to have gotten away from a lot of things that just naturally were inherently instinctual that worked really well.
and from the biological point of view, when you let the kid cry, and by the way, the blessed Dr. Spock, if you remember
Hmm.
Benjamin Spock, he wrote about the tyranny of the infant who wants to be picked up. He said the tyranny of the infant. And generations of parents were taught to ignore the tyranny of the infant by just walking out on the child, on an infant.
Unfortunately, that my mom read that book, so I know
Yeah,
this one.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what actually on a neurobiological level, what's happening is the child's brain is flooded with cortisol,
Yes.
which interferes with healthy brain development. So
Well,
that
and you're really talking about, if somebody comes into a traumatized family, or it could even be contextual. I mean, like coming into World War II, right? You have experience of that. So it's sometimes the parents trying to do the best they can, but they're in a situation that's horrible. But when you come into a really traumatizing situation, then the brain starts to uh, emphasize the parts of the brain that are threat related. So you're very quick to scan for threat. You're very quick to trigger into a sense of feeling like the world is dangerous. Little triggers can trigger you into this fear state very quickly. If you're born into a pro-social family where relationships are really valued and connection is really valued, and they have skills, secure attachment skills related to that, then the pro-social parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, the parts of the brain that are really organizing around how to connect and learn how to read social cues for connection, all those things don't get wiped out. And it makes a huge difference on how you experience the world, or how you experience yourself in the world, how you experience or what you expect from other people. It's such a huge part of the human journey, and I think it deserves a lot of attention for
so
how
for
we
that
move forward as a culture, as a family, as an individual. I mean, I wish all of our leaders in the world would learn a lot about secure attachment. I think it would be the fastest way to change our culture, is if we could somehow provide families with a lot of experiential and really good help on how to be connected in there when they have children from the very beginning.
so
It's a huge healing possibility there.
so in my own history, I've always focused on the obvious. Like I was a Jewish infant under the Nazis in Hungary, and so you can imagine the rest. But forget the Nazis and forget the Second World War and forget the genocide. Forget any of that. I read my mother's diary that she kept when I was an infant just a few months ago, and she says it's 2 in the morning, and I'm 3 weeks old, and she says it's 2 in the morning, and you've been crying for the last hour and a half to be fed, but I promised the doctors that I would feed you on schedule. So my heart was breaking, writes my mother, as I watched you cry for the last hour and a half. And then I gave in 10 minutes earlier and I fed you. Now just talk about that. And all this woman is doing, and she loves the child, she adored me, and her heart was breaking, but she was following expert advice. So just talk about the attachment impact of that little. Forget the Nazis. Forget all that stuff.
Right,
Just
right, right.
just that little thing. If you just talk about that, what do you see there?
Well, it's just so much of a child can't experience that other than neglect, that
Yeah.
somebody's not there. And one of the ways insecure attachment happens, of course, is from severe and ongoing neglect, even if it's trying to follow doctor's orders that don't, now we understand, don't make sense, but back then were held in high regard. Um, it has a huge impact. So it's like a child being left alone too much, and especially in a distressed state, because as you know, the secure attachment system is designed to have the parent be the secure base. Like the child has distress, they reach out for the parent, right? With their eyes or with their fingers or with their gurgle or their cooing. And if the parent doesn't respond or doesn't understand those cues, maybe from their own attachment injury upline, because this comes down generationally very easily. We learn a lot about how we parent from our parents, or unresolved trauma interferes with how we parent. But so learning, when a child doesn't have a response, then they sort of get thrown into trying to do it themselves, maybe and they're way over their head. They are very dependent when they're really little. So it's this kind of what I call reactive autonomy, where they basically often are dissociating and coming back into feeling like there's nobody out there. So what's the point of even reaching? They eventually hit resignation. They don't even coo or even try to find the eyes of the parent, because they experience the parent as not there. And to be an infant and looking up and seeing a vacant parent, that's terrifying. That's not just somebody not being there. That's like, oh my God, I'm completely dependent on this human being and nobody's home. And then, of course, it can be worse than that because the parent can also be rejecting. They can be just not present, but also like their eyes can have anger or hatred in them. Their eye contact's a really big piece of this too.
So how about these days when a kid looks up and the parent is
looking at a device? Yeah. Same thing. No, there's no eye contact. There's nobody there. They experience it as nobody there. The research shows that if you even have a cell phone turned off and face down on a dinner table, you're reducing intimacy by 35%. Just to get the phone out of the picture or whatever it is. Devices can be really divisive, as one of my friends likes to say.
Wow. Okay. So let's just say then, which by the way, I often talk with people on my work on addiction or physical illness or mental health conditions. And people say, but I had a really happy childhood, And then I issue what I call the Happy Childhood Challenge, where it takes me about 3 minutes. And what usually, and people get it, and what usually shows up is just that lack of attunement. That maybe they weren't hurt, maybe their parents loved them, did their best, they had lots of happy moments. But when it came down to it, they were left feeling alone and unconnected with when it really mattered. And that just
I think we have an epidemic of that in this country, or in the world, really.
I believe as well. So recognizing all that, then, how do you then work with that in the adult to heal that trauma?
One of the things that I really spent a lot of time looking at is what is the core wound for each of the insecure attachment styles. And I know we don't have an endless time. I could talk about this forever. But let's say for the avoidant attachment, that sometimes is called dismissive as an adult, usually they've been isolated, left alone too much, or actively rejected, or only talked to when they're learning a skill. So there's a lot of left brain development, but not much access to right brain. So there's not emotional attunement. There's not somebody present. There's not somebody that's attuned to their needs. They're not even recognizing maybe their own needs or other people. They don't believe other people will be any good at recognizing or fulfilling their needs. So they become very self-focused, and they kind of disconnect from others. Their knee-jerk reaction to difficulties is to withdraw. And it's like how they can start to feel that in their own body. And what we try to do is have sort of corrective exercises like your Happy Child Challenge. I might say something like, well, look out into the world and just imagine seeing kind eyes that are full of presence looking back at you. And that might be enough to trigger a wound, or it might also feel really good, depending on how they hold it.
So let me jump in here, because you're describing me. So avoidant is my particular style. I mean, I know that there's all kinds of mixes of these attachment styles, but avoidant predominates for me. In my marriage of 52 years now coming up, when things go quote unquote wrong, where I perceive myself as being quote unquote wrong, my style is to withdraw, to detach.
Yes.
No, it's hopeless. This will never work. After 5 decades of marriage, I can still have this thought that this will never work out.
I know it can be very consistent, persistent,
and that it's futile to even try and communicate. Then I just withdraw. So that's a dynamic in me, and I've become much more adept at modulating it and recognizing it and not believing it when it arises, but it can still arise as a dynamic. So what would you tell me about that?
Well, just to think about how this might work in a couple, if people are really aware of each other's attachment styles, you can actually be really helpful to each other. Like if I was in a partner with an avoidant person, I might say I might be having a lot of emotions about something, which is often hard to tolerate for an avoidant because they haven't had much support in feeling their own emotions. I might say, hey, honey, I get it that I just lost my grandmother or something, and I'm feeling a lot of emotion, that this might be hard for you. I really need you to be here for me, but I get it that you might need to take a break. So go walk the dog for however long you need to do it, whatever that is, 15, 30 minutes, whatever. And then if you're okay coming back and knowing you can take breaks, I really need you to hear me on this. So I can support the possibility of you leaning into the emotion versus knee-jerk withdrawing, but also understanding you might have a temporary need to withdraw, right? So that there would be ways you can talk to each other that you understand to not take these reactions personally, because they so often come from the original relational template from whatever happened in early childhood.
So I think you just explained my wife has been telling me for all these decades to go take a hike. Maybe that's...
But to come back, right, and lean into the conversation.
Yeah,
right?
She never said
but to do it at your own pace.
Yeah.
you know.
Okay.
And then as people get kinder to each other about these patterns, they all both can move towards secure attachment. So it gets a little easier to have secure attachment skills operate in themselves and also in their relationships. And that's kind of what we're trying to do from a therapeutic stance. But couples can also do it with each other because you're living with each other. You know, we're spending a lot of time together. Um, but when I was doing this idea of like looking out in the world and seeing kind eyes, for somebody that's avoidant, that sounds very benign, like looking out and looking for kind eyes. Like, how hard is that? But if you have avoidant attachment, this happened for me because I have an aspect of avoidant in myself as well. I would just see my mother's hatred. My mother had a hatred when I was a little kid. She was dealing with some stuff, and that was how it came out. But I would always see hatred first. So it was hard for me to make authentic eye contact with people because I had to sort of deal with the first response, which was expecting them to look really harshly at me. And I had to become conscious of that because I wasn't conscious of it. As I did this work, I became conscious that that's what I saw first. And then in practicing to like actually let that pass through and then see the actual look in the actual person's eyes, which might actually be loving or something, then I had to practice taking that in because I didn't know what to do with loving eye contact. I had no biological receptor for that, you know? So I had to work myself to stay present for someone who was actually being caring towards me because it was so different than my original experience. And that's what I try to support people to do, is to kind of come out of their automatic responses and actually to own their automatic responses, because we all have certain attachment patterns that we aren't at fault for. I mean, they happen because they happen depending on what we were exposed to. But then to learn to challenge it a little bit at your own pace, to lean in when you want to withdraw, or to self-soothe when you want to co-opt somebody else's, you want to just take over and have them do everything for you. There's just different ways that attachment can get off secure, and then these specific ways to suggest a possibility of a new behavior that might actually take them towards secure attachment. It's all informed by what does secure attachment look like, because my belief is, and I think John Bowlby agrees with me, that secure attachment is biologically in there. It just has a lot of things that are interfering with it or dumped on top of it or whatever. And as we peel it off, I'm really like a hawk in a session with somebody looking at, hey, that's your secure attachment coming up. Even though it might feel uncomfortable, that's actually the real thing. So when an avoidance starts to feel a genuine longing to connect, everything in them is going to say, this is wrong. This is going to go to a bad place. I'm going to get in trouble here. But when they start to realize that's my secure attachment, this longing to connect is actually authentic, it's a good thing. But the person with them, whether it's a partner, a therapist, or a friend, they need to be able to be there and be present in a really kind way to allow that vulnerability, and the person can experiment with the possibility of nourishment in a relationship before they, feel everything in their head saying, you got to get out of here, disconnect, and to challenge that knee-jerk reaction, and to start to feel what is nourishment in a relationship feel like. And that's extremely vulnerable for the avoidant. And if we understand that compassionately, we can try to have a space where that's okay to allow to happen. But if you get distracted or your phone rings and you pick up your phone, you just gave them the same message over again. So you have to be really sensitive to not drop the contact when a person is moving into that. And when they do it in a repeated way, they start to realize, oh, connection can be a good thing. I can actually trust this person, or this person actually can fulfill a need, or this person can actually be loving, and I can work to stay present for it. That's what I call crossing the bridge to secure attachment, that you're incrementally moving back towards your original design, though. That's the hopefulness in this. Our original design is for secure attachment. And eventually we recognize it as feeling right, that it feels better, there's more well-being, we feel more authentic, all of those things. Our capacity to love grows.
Okay, so as we close, I hear you saying two things, well, many things, but two essential lessons here that I'm getting is, number one, if we can compassionately recognize our own attachment styles or the attachment styles of the people that we're in a relationship with, and not take them personally, either not making it my own fault that I have that style or their fault that they have that particular style, but we can compassionately recognize the style and kind of just look at it with some understanding. That's in itself very healing. Number one, that's one thing I hear you saying. The other thing I hear you saying is that authentic attachment, or the care system in our brains, the authentic self, that's an inherent quality of human beings. And we
Yes.
can actually learn to recognize it. and recognizing it as our real selves rather than mistaking ourselves for our traumatic patterns or attachment styles is where the healing actually is. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, yes. And having the courage to work with those younger states in us,
Yeah.
that do feel the wound, and going and meeting that part and trying to have a intrapsychic, and also like maybe a therapist or a partner talking to that part to find out what they need, what they felt was missing, and to be attuned and represent the primary attachment figure or the secure attachment energy to meet that young wounded parts of us and meet the need, bring in the protection, or bring in the kindness, or bring in the loving contact, or bring in the listening ear or the empathetic other in a way that they can start to feel it from the younger age. And then it just automatically, that can happen intracyclically, because you can have the adult part of the person be compassionate with the younger part of the person. But as that healing happens, it has to happen, I think, experientially and in a sensate way in the age the wound actually happened, and to give support to people to be able to tolerate the pain that's there, because it can be quite painful. So you want to give people resources enough that they can integrate and be resilient as they're experiencing the courage to take them into these early states that were wounded.
So let me close by owning my own experience talking with you. Okay. So the way that the camera is set up and the way that this has to work is, for me to seem like I'm looking at you, I'm actually not looking at you at all. I'm having to look into a camera. When I lower my eyes to look at you and take in your face, it's so much more of a pleasant and inviting experience to see your smile and your warmth, and to have that, in Stephen Porges' word, the social engagement system activated. I'm looking at you right now, but I'm not looking at the camera. So when I'm looking at you, people don't see me as looking at them or facing the camera. It itself is alienating to have to communicate like this. Like I really enjoy our conversation, but what I'm saying is that having to look at a camera rather than a human being actually gets in the way of the experience being as rich and fulfilling as it might otherwise be. So
Absolutely.
I was going through this experience speaking with you with this double awareness that on the one hand I need to keep looking at the camera so as to look right on camera, on the other hand missing the actual interaction with you.
And that's I think a great example of the experience when things are off in the attunement, right?
Yeah.
Between humans, sometimes somebody might actually be looking at you, but they're not seeing you, And so when someone actually is seeing you with a, kindness in their eyes or receptivity in their eyes, they're present in the contact, that makes all the difference in terms of how you experience the connection. So if we think of trauma as broken connection, kind of looking at everything we can do to help people feel available for connection to themselves, to other people, and to up the quality of that connection can be so powerfully healing for whatever other trauma they've faced. It's sort of a fundamental healing that I think is quite possible, and it does have its challenges. I'm not trying to say it's super simple, but it can happen, because I think we do inherently have secure attachment on our side, and biologically we are pro-social, and sometimes we just have a lot of clutter and difficulty to clear to resurrect that, but it is there.
Okay,
Our
so
essential
then,
selves.
okay, so then to close, I'm going to look away from the camera and look at you and just thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. I so
Thank,
appreciate being here. Such a privilege to meet you.
thank you.
Well, thank you. That was a brilliant conversation, very alive and enlightening.
Very rich. And Diane, I had a huge mind-opening or eye-opening realization. I always had discomfort when I was confronted with a direct eye contact, and I never understood why. And now I understand that I'm always bracing for criticism or for kind of aggressive energy starting in my childhood, that I project that to any loving eye gaze. So thank you for that realization, and I have now something to work with.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you both for the rich conversation.